The Finance Committee meeting to order at 7:20 and apologize for the lateness. Do we need to do a roll call?
Chow. Here. Hanyabuti.
Here.
Here. All right, so we got a few things, a few probably pretty quick action items that were in our packet that was shared in advance of the meeting. The first are the minutes from the December 9th Finance Committee meeting. So there's a motion to recommend that the minutes of December 9th Finance Committee meeting are approved as presented. Are there any questions about the minutes? The riveting minutes? All right.
Yes. Did you need a
I
motion?
did. Well, I move that that the Finance Committee recommends that the minutes of December 9th be approved as presented.
Second.
Chow.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. The asbestos abatement bid approval. Can you walk us through that?
So, we released a bid that was shepherded along by TrueNow, the district asbestos consultant, for abatement work at Haven, Nichols, Washington, Arlington, Willard, MLK, and we got, the bids were open, and the winning bidder is Holian. And at the price that we received, the bid is actually about $25,000 lower than what we had budgeted. So we're able to realize some savings in that we can then use for additional projects in the future.
Awesome. Any questions?
At the bottom of the memo, Raphael, there were some key upcoming dates. And I love that this is starting so quickly after school. I'm wondering what the timeline for the work is going to be. I know we've run up to, I'm wondering what the timeline is so that we can ensure our schools are ready to be open on time.
Oh, the plan is for this to be finished no longer than 3 weeks.
Nice.
And we're actually hoping to be finished before that.
And the list of abatement that has to be done is getting shorter. And there's,
Actually not.
no? We always have like a really long list of abatement
Yes,
work.
we do. Yes, we do. And
So this is just a small amount.
Yes, we're just scratching the surface. In the
Literally.
60s, asbestos were used for everything. They were used on floors, they were used on boilers, they were used for everything. Because at that point, no one realized how dangerous asbestos is. So we're trying to abate them now, but we still got quite a way to go. So what we've been focusing on are the ones that are friable. So the asbestos are now disturbed and they're covered with a carpet, they're actually safe. So we're getting to the ones that needs to be taken care of, but we still got ways to go. We can eliminate all asbestos in all our district facilities.
All right.
Can I just add one more thing? In your stakeholder engagement, I just want to say thank you to Don and the man from True North is escaping me because I do think that he's been
Right.
working with the union to really try and make sure that our educators are aware of the process. So I know that's not on there and that's fine, but I just want to acknowledge that Don and True North and Raphael are really trying to work to ensure that, and we're going to continue that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for saying so. So the Finance Committee recommends that the asbestos abatement bid for summer 2020 projects be presented to the full board for approval.
Second. Chow.
Yes.
Hanyabuti.
Yes.
Milburn.
Yes. And the fiscal year 2020 Round 1 School Maintenance Project Grant. Money.
Yeah, this was a grant that was released by ISB, and it's now turning to assist school district in doing some maintenance work on facilities. And the grant amount is about $50,000. So we've completed the application, we just need approval from the board. Since we have all the capital projects planned already, this would be a way to reduce the expenditure in local funds by $50,000. And that will allow us to use that $50,000 to do additional projects down the line.
So it's a matching grant, so
Yes, sir.
50,000 that we've identified will be matched.
And there's a possibility after the first round, depending on how many schools apply for it, there may be additional money available that we may then apply for and get additional funds.
Any questions about free money?
Not a question, but just a thank you to you and your team. I mean, this is the second thing now with the bond refinancing last year and now this, where you have really creatively tried to find revenue for us for these capital projects that we so desperately need. So just thank you for continuing to look for and find these opportunities.
All right, the Finance Committee recommends that the fiscal year 2020 Round 1 School Maintenance Project Grant be presented to the full board for approval.
Second.
Chow,
Yes.
Tanya Rudy,
Yes.
Redburn,
Yes. And the last one is the recommendation about the multi-tier fee structure for the 1920 school year.
So tonight we are presenting a new fee for Camp Timberley. Camp Timberley is a 2-day, 1-night outdoor education program that's been around for almost 50 years for 5th graders. This program is financed with student fees, some donations, and primarily local funds. I included a couple tables in the memo, one that shows expenditures and revenues for the last couple of years, plus the budget. Total expenses are about $150,000. Usually on average, we collect around $75,000, $80,000 in fees, and the rest of the support comes from School District 65. We are currently charging $121.25. That's the fee, and there's only one fee. There is no reduced fee or fee that we charge. It's basically one fee, and then because families often struggle with that fee, they are required to apply for waiver, administrative waiver, and we try to help in a way. Most of the free lunch families do not pay, they don't pay, and even reduced families, they receive large reductions in fee. So we would like to propose, and David Wartowski, the director of STEM, he's not here, but him and I, we wrote the memo together. We agreed that it's time for multi-tier fee that would take in consideration families' ability to pay, and that would greatly reduce families' burden, because now they have to make a phone call, they have to reach out to us, yes, it would result in slightly smaller revenues, but we feel that's more equitable and a simpler way to handle that fee. We are recommending a small increase, 3%, so the fee is $125 for full lunch families, $75 for reduced lunch families, and then symbolic $25 fee for free lunch families, and administrative waiver is still available for those who will find that these fees are still too high. We still will be accepting donations. In fact, we will be putting something on our website which hopefully will simplify the process of donating, because right now, in order to pay a donation, you have to have an account on RefTrack. So we want to put something in place for anyone to contribute on our website without registering through RefTrack, without having student ID and so on. So we are working on it. Registration for Camp Timberley is around the corner. So there is our recommendation to put this multi-tier fee in place. There's also another concern, and that's why along with that recommendation, there's also recommendation to look for research alternatives to this camp, because to be frank, I mean, this program, as wonderful as it is and educational as it is, it's also costing the district a lot of money. Last 3 years, it created a deficit of $300,000, which is equivalent to almost, 5 teachers. So, we are facing structural deficits. We will be facing structural deficit, operating deficits in a couple of years. So we feel that we would like to see what's out there, if there is an alternative to that program.
Now, one option that we talked about possibly is doing a day trip at a camp closer here. The cost of that will be less than this. And it's just to reiterate what Kathy just said, in view of the financial challenges that the district faces and the need to make sure students get the best education possible, just spending $300,000 the last 3 years to subsidize an overnight trip, I'm not sure if that's the best way to spend those funds.
And we know that the costs are going up, because transportation costs will be going up. The camp itself, I think David got an email recently, the increase is minimal. I think it's 1 or 2%, but we know that transportation may be as high as 30%.
So when you say 300,000 deficit, this particular trip, do you mean compounded over 2 years, like?
Yeah, we just
or
over 3 years.
over 3 years?
So
In addition to the 75,000 that we're subsidizing?
No, this is I just added the 3 years.
Oh, 75,000
Yes.
times 3. Okay.
Yeah.
So the
All
first
right,
year,
great.
for
Thank
example,
you.
I'm sorry, 3 years ago, we had to subsidize it by $136,000. Last year, $72,000, we had to subsidize it. And we're projected to subsidize it with another $89,000 this year.
Thank you for the clarification.
And I appreciate you both saying or asking the question about, not about the value of the program, but are there alternatives to this type of program? Because in the memo, it's a science experience, right? It's, but I'm sure it's also teamwork and it's also community building, and I'm sure there's other ways that we can do those things too. That it's also not just transportation costs. I know we pay like the staff stipends. We need a nurse there the entire week while we send our kids there, and it's overnight, so there's additional costs for staff.
Are those costs included in the
Yes.
subsidized by the district? So that's,
Did you run what the break-even would be for if you were to have it not be subsidized, what the fee for full?
We did a few years back. I think that was 4 years ago when we brought it to the board, and I think the costs would have to be over $250 per person. And we actually brought that scenario to the board, and the board felt, and we felt that if parents are struggling right now, to pay, 120, there's no way that they would be
I was
paying.
just saying in light of a tiered format, that we didn't have a tiered pricing then, right? It was either waiver or pay.
so have a tier that has the full price even
Full
higher.
price at the highest level.
Actually, I think they would be double, because if the cost is about let's say 160, and we're gonna be collecting about, 70,000 under the multi-tier, then roughly we would have to increase like maybe 110%.
Should we not at least have the single fee be the cost? Even though it would amortize, we're still offsetting the cost that we're not getting, but 160 versus 125? It seems like if this year we're
At the outset, we're giving people a discount.
we're giving them a discount before we even factor in very real discounts for folks who can't. And I'm not saying that everybody that is full price that's easy for, but it just seems to me that we're choosing 125 because it's not that much higher than what we already, it's only, would you say 3% higher?
3%.
And yet our costs are escalating at significantly higher than that. So, you know, what organization does that? None do. We can't, we need to be understanding of folks that can't afford, they want the same experience, but I think it's fair to offer, to say it's $160 for those families, that if that is the price, if you amortize it over the full number of students. We're not asking them to pay for other children, you know, the district is offsetting that, but we're asking them to pay the full price of this. And then you can also look at, okay, is there, you know, is that shift demand for the program, and is that a better way to then move into something different?
I was just going to suggest that might be a way to figure out what the loyalty to this particular program is versus the appetite for looking for something different. I mean, it's a little bit different, I think, because this is part of the curriculum that we offer, and, you know, so it isn't like a separate, like, it's part of their school day. So I think, you know, saying there's an argument there that maybe that should be that there should be partially subsidized by the district, but I think that it's not a bad idea to at least say, raise it a little bit more, and then that gives us some gauge of, you know, is that enough that people say, well, we want this experience for our kids, but we want to find, you know, an alternative that will give us something similar, or is this program, because I know it's been a very long standing, right? I mean, this is.
I went to Camp Timberlake.
Yeah, so, so I just think, you know, before we make that change and say we're going to look, and I, you know, I support looking at other options, but this is a way to have that conversation and let people understand, well, this is why we're looking at other options, because not to look at other options, this is what the actual cost would be.
We're happy to do a break even and come back and let you know what the actual cost will be.
I'm not sure if we have time though, because I know the
when is
registration is starting at the end of this month. So our hope was to have it approved at the board meeting, and then basically release the numbers to parents. I know David is anxious to start communicating with schools. So, and that was my question. So let's say if we were to increase the full fee, so it represents true cost, are we talking about this year, or are we talking maybe in the future? So what's the board's?
Well, my thought was, we know today what we're basing in terms of number of students. We know what the total cost is. We can divide it here. Whatever that amount is what we should target as the price for this year. In future years, we may be considering other alternatives, right? But in the meantime, you know, from a fiduciary responsibility, like at least trying to cover our costs where we can, understanding, you know, we've tried to control that cost, I'm assuming, right? We've tried to control that increase in cost. So whatever that number is, which I think you guys could compute pretty easily, right now, is what I would recommend as an alternative price for the single.
And then still have
The tiers.
And
Still have the tiers, the other tiers could remain the same. I'm not suggesting we change those. I'm just suggesting we change the full fee, yeah.
As someone who has a fifth grader who's going this year, from my perspective, we haven't gotten such concrete information that it would be, for the people who can afford it, I don't think it would be dramatically, a substantial change to make that happen for this year. I don't know. We've gotten some information, but I don't know.
It would be a substantial change for, I know at my kid's school, they do fundraisers throughout the year to help support, because they're used to the $125 fee for everybody.
Right.
So they try to raise a dollar amount to cover for the students who can't afford the $125. And I guess if you're going to a tiered structure, you have a $25 fee for the free and reduced lunch kids. You have a different fee structure. So that might make it a little bit easier, but there may be a gap there that is late.
But I think the increase to the full price would still be offset by
Right.
So for any schools that are doing that sort of fundraising, I don't think it would dramatically change
That's true, because 25 is a lower threshold.
Right, or the 75 and the 25, like having the tiers.
And the
If we're saying
administrative
160.
waiver still exists, so there's that option still too.
I guess my only question would be, is there a group of people that would, that qualify in our current system that wouldn't qualify in the shift, but would maybe need help, right? So that if that $40 took someone who could have afforded it to not being able to afford it, that would be, I would want us to have some kind of system addition to waiver that people in that group could claim hardship if they needed to with that fee adjustment, but I think there's probably some money on the table that we're not taking advantage of from people who would without a challenge. So as long as we give people an option who then might be impacted by the change to get support, it might be worth testing.
I just want to ensure when you look at your recommendations about researching, can you make sure to include the stakeholders of educators who have been going to this quite a bit, to make sure that there's a group represented in doing the research.
I don't think Kathy and Raphael were going to do the research. I think probably teaching and learning was going to do that, but
I want to ensure that educators are a part
Yeah.
of the process.
hopefully, there's probably a
because
committee for that.
Reality is that the educators are there at the camp and really the ones who are immersed in the experiences with them. So if we're going to have looking at other options, they need to be at the table to also do the research.
They know what needs to.
By all means, thank you.
Thank you.
So then, will you just come to when we vote on this as a full board with the actual?
With the amended-
So the
The amended table
reduced and
2.
free tiers will stay the same. It'll just be an amending on the full price tier.
Awesome. So the Finance Committee recommends that the multi-tier fee structure for the 2019-20 school year be presented to the full board for approval.
Second.
As amended, or? Did you say it would be at tonight's full board?
No. When we vote on this as a full board.
They'll bring a new
a regular
memo.
That's not happening tonight. That'll happen in our next
But
regular meeting.
They're still taking the multi-tier fee structure to
that's
the
all we're
board.
saying, yes, not
But
the
it'll
actual
be a
pricing.
different.
Gotcha.
It will
Yes.
be amended as discussed.
Thank you. Yes.
Tanya Rudy?
Yes.
Second. Then yes.
Yes. I think Camp Timberley was a pretty good kickoff to our one discussion item tonight, which is the fiscal year 21 to 25 financial projections. And I think we're starting off with a slideshow,
Yes.
Kathy?
We have a brief presentation of updated financial projections. Last time we looked at the financial projections was in September with the final budget. They have changed slightly. We have some new information that we would like to share with the board and with the public. And I would like to start with some important financial highlights. Overall financial situation of District 65 has improved due to the 2017 referendum. Thank you to the Evanston and Skokie community for voting for it. We continue to upgrade our buildings to ensure that all school buildings have safe entrances. There is still a site or two that we're working on, but we're getting close to that list. And we're still in negotiations with some of our unions. And I would like to bring your attention to the slide, which pictures district's operating revenues, and our dependence on local properties continues. As you can see, this blue wedge portion of the pie, that represents property taxes, and it accounts for 78% of our all revenues. Only 10% comes from the state, and 6% comes from the federal government. We have some new information affecting property taxes. The new CPI for 2019 calendar year, which was recorded in December, so the CPI from December of 2019, which was just reported last year in January, will affect how much our property taxes will increase in fiscal year 22. We start getting it in fiscal 21, but the adjustment comes in the next fiscal year. That's why it's always, we feel the effect of the CPI in FY 22. I'm saying that it's new and it's different because we had 1.5 in our projections. Subsequent years will have, in these projections, have 1.5 CPI, so that has not changed. Also, we're revising assumption for investment income. And hopefully some of this extra revenue from property taxes will offset that loss. 6 months ago, interest rates were about 2.25. Now they only 1.5. So district will be losing, not receiving the approximately $400,000 in interest income that we were counting on. And again, that affects subsequent years as well. And this graph illustrates history of the CPI, and I think we've been lucky last few years. Inflation is up, 2.2 followed 1.9 and 2.1, but if you look at the years before, I mean, there were 4 years, under 2%. So with global economy slowing down, especially in light of the coronavirus, we may see recession, and that's what we're hearing. So that's why we are being conservative, and that's what we need to do as stewards of the public funds. It's always easier to increase the revenues, but it's very difficult to bring it down. And just for your information, 10-year CPI average is still 1.75. So it's still quite low. With state revenues, we're keeping it flat. If you remember, evidence-based funding replaced general state aid in 2017. It's really tied to our enrollment, which is projected to be flat and declining, actually, in out years. So for these projections, we're keeping the amounts flat. 2.5% increase for federal aid. That's where all of our title grants are, Medicaid, Head Start, IDEA. And although we're still collecting rebates from Build America bonds, the district sold them in 2010, they are ending in FY 23, and we collect about 200,000. Currently, I believe is about 240. And it's a percentage of the interest that the district paid is reimbursed to us via a program that was put by President Obama in place in 2010. Another pie chart, this illustrates district's operating expenditures, and you can see from this that we are, the majority of our expenditures is spent on staff. 80% salaries and benefits, only 7% is spent on tangible items. Things from capital building improvements to technology to student and teacher materials, textbooks, only 7% of our budget. The rest is services and staff. I want to walk through quickly assumptions for our biggest expenditure, salaries. So because the district negotiated a contract with our educators at the end of last fiscal year, and teacher assistants, those numbers, those increases are in. What's different in this projections is the cost of teachers, because the teachers' contracts is tied to CPI. So on their old projections, the salaries in FY23 only reflected what was in the contract and the floor, which was 1.5 2.75, because we know the actual CPI now, it's 2.3. What we did, we added this extra cost to salary expenditures in projections. That's why when you compare them, the salaries are looking higher, and it's because of that adjustment due to the CPI. So CPI is not only affecting our revenues, but in this case is also affecting our expenditures. Now in FY25, because it was a 5-year contract, salaries are estimated, and we are using a 3.5% assumption for that year. Employee benefit, that's where another change for prior projection is. Health insurance, and it's not a good change, health insurance premiums are projected to increase 8% next year. And it's because of our group's experience, loss ratio, which means that which is at 111%. This means that we spent, the insurance providers spent 11% more on our group in insurance claims what we send in our premiums. The co-op average, and the co-op includes 116 school districts, the average was about 5%. There were some school districts with 1%, there were some as high as 10%. We are unfortunate, because of our experience, are with the 8 and the 10%, and there are ways to reduce that risk. Teledoc, wellness screening, we have to, we, and I mean the district administration, we have to work and promote these programs. And actually at the last insurance meeting that we had last week, we talked with our union representatives of various ways to attack wellness screening and teledoc. And you know, right now our participation is very low. So I think there's a lot that we can do, and that will help everybody, because that 8%, it's going to be felt not only by the district but also by employees. Pension cost shift is still in the out years. We are using it as a placeholder. Again, if the legislation is not passed, it will not be incorporated into the budget. Purchase services, another big increase. Transportation costs were bid this year, and the bid came back with 30% increase, or a $1 million increase. We only had one bidder, a current provider, Positive Connections, and they increased their prices by 30%. It's not going to be 30% because Raphael is working very hard with them. So we are in post-bid negotiations. So definitely, you know, it's not going to be 30%. You want to say something?
Just interject. So we received the bid on the 7th, and it went up by $1 million just the first year. And they were talking about 5% each year in the out years. When I saw it, nearly had a heart attack. So called them and told them I wanted to know what land they were living in. So we had a meeting this past Tuesday where we met with the president of the company, the general manager, and also the depot manager. And we had a come to Jesus meeting, if you will, where we said, it's not going to happen. There's no way we're going to pay 30%. If our largest source of revenue is only CPI, we can't do that. So they came up and they gave reasons why they needed 30%. One of it was an increase in employee salaries. We are one of the lowest paid, their staff were one of the lowest paid bus driver in the area. The average salary is about $19.25. They were paying much lower than that. So they raised their prices this year, actually last year, when we really went after them for non-performance. So they hired more driver, they offered their current driver more money, and they also paid bonuses. So they're now paying $17.50. So they were hoping to capture that. I said, I understood that, but you don't have to do that all in 1 year. They were also talking about upgrading their fleet. And I said, you know what? It makes sense, but it really doesn't make sense. We're in a small village. Evanston is not that big, where we need to swipe out our fleet every couple of years. I thought it was reasonable to expect their buses to last for at least 10 years. So I said they can wait on replacing their fleet. And we don't have a history of buses breaking down. So we can wait on that. If they did that, that should result in lower pricing too. And the last thing they mentioned was the penalty that we charge them. Every time they're late, we charge them a pretty steep penalty. I said, I understood that we can be reasonable in giving them grace periods. They don't make changes after a grace period that we can negotiate, and then we can issue a penalty. So there's no point in them charging us for penalty that we may never have to impose. So that was another way to try to get pricing down. So at the end of the conversation, we both agreed that they had to go back and come up with a revised bid. So they came back on Friday with a revised bid, and the price actually from about 30% went to 19%. So that was a savings of $1 million. So I talked to them again. I said, we're getting warned that we need to do better. So I told them the price point where we needed to be, 10 to 12% seems reasonable. And in the out years, 2.3 to 3% at the most for CPI. So they are supposed to get back to me tomorrow. So this prices is not reflected in the projection that you see. The prices that you see in the projection is based on the $1 million increase. But as it stands today, it's more $500,000 increase. But we're hopeful that we'll be able to get even more concession in prices than what we have today.
So yeah, information was, we didn't have it in time to increase with the projections, so they reflect 30% increase. Assumptions for supplies, capital outlay, other objects, which is the net cost of Park School and special education tuition and termination benefits, are basically the same. What we used last time, we will continue to allocate $1,025,000 for capital outlay per board's resolution from 2017. There is a small adjustment that looks like a spike in cost for other objects, 15%. That's because of the timing. That's because due to timing of Park School revenues. In 2019, tuition from CPS did not come in before June 30th. It came in July. So because of that, shares for District 65 and 202, because we share the cost between the two school districts, went down. In FY21, we are going back to the regular level. So it's just timing, it's a wash, there is no increase. And there is, of course, a lot of uncertainties, mainly related to CPI factors after 2022 and beyond. We've, of course, still negotiating this year. We're negotiating with childcare units, with Secretariat Union next year, with ECMA, custodial and maintenance workers. And then, of course, there's property tax legislation is not dead. And actually what we are hearing, that we may be coupled with progressive Illinois income tax, and it may be sneaked somewhere by the legislature. So that's unfortunately a big unknown, and we ran analysis few years back. I don't know if the board remembers, but it was in the millions. And that's why we feel there is really no point to include these numbers in the numbers to create, because we really don't know. And the legislature has been talking about it for probably half a decade. But again, we're watching it, and it may become reality.
From what we're hearing, there's going to be some kind of tax freeze. It's a matter of if it's temporary or long-term. But the politicians in Springfield are saying that in order to sell the progressive income tax, there needs to be some form of property tax freeze to make it sellable, because voters want property tax relief. So it's going to impact our revenue one way or the other. We just don't know how it's going to shape out. So I think that should figure into how we plan for the future.
This slide is very busy, I understand, but if you could just focus to I circle a couple numbers, and there are a couple boxes. An overall message from this slide is the same message. Basically, we have, we will be balanced through FY22 with operating deficits starting in FY23. And we will have a balanced budget, not true balanced budget, because reserves will have to be used to balance budget through FY25. A true balanced budget is when you have enough revenues, current revenues, to cover current expenditures, not really use your reserves. And that will end in FY22, which means we have 2 more years to basically come up with a plan to come up with efficiencies. This is going to look better because of the adjustment with transportation. It's not going to be 30%. Expenditures on this slide reflect 30% increase. So basically, we will probably have $500,000 in reduction in expenditures, and then million in the second year, $1.5 million, and so on. So, but again, the message, the main message, it's not going to be changed. It's not going to be enough to eliminate the deficit in FY23. This slide shows, for those of you who wonder how these projections look different from September projections, I just put together a quick slide to show what went up, what went down. So revenues went down, revenues went up by 1.4 million, again, because of the CPI, because of additional revenues. We also have an increase in expenditures, 2.3 million, transportation, health insurance, and some adjustments to salaries. And as a result, our deficit for the FY25, because that's what you're seeing here, is the final year of the table, is bigger by almost $1 million. And then, of course, that reflects on the total amount of referendum reserves, right? I mean, because if you have less revenues, you have more expenditures, and you're generating bigger deficits, it's gonna eat, that deficit's gonna eat into your reserves quicker. And we are hoping that with the new adjustment from transportation, these reserves could be still around 10 million at the end of FY25, assuming everything else checks out, but we know it doesn't and it won't.
In addition to just negotiation with the transportation provider, since we seem to be limited, what we're also doing is looking at other options as a way to control transportation costs. One of the scenarios that we've ran, and this is just a scenario, is the possibility of adjusting start time in a couple of our schools. Because currently we run about 32 tier, which means once a bus drops a school up, goes back and pick up another school. We run 30 of those. And we also run 16 single tier. The difference between the double and the single is only $40. So if we have more double tier, if we were to do 7 routes with double tier, we have the possibility of saving an additional $5 million. $500,000. Possibility of saving another $500,000.
Are there bus companies that cannot bid on our district because they don't have the fleet big enough to handle it? Will a change like that open up us to vendors that have smaller fleets but can handle it because we stack them like that?
Yes, we are actually in conversation with another bus company that I'd rather not name as an alternate in case we can't get to a sweet spot with our current provider. So we are thinking about everything we can to reduce transportation costs. Because the way we look at it, we're trying to make sure that whatever reduction we make doesn't impact our students in the classroom. So this is one area where we have more flexibility with programming and with creative thinking. So I just want to put that out there. So we may come back and talk to you about it, but we're talking about that as a possibility of saving another $500,000 in transportation costs.
In 2017, the board directed the business office to monitor referendum reserves. And that's what this slide represents. We started with $18.5 million. That was the first amount added to the fund balance. We are projecting to add $4.2 million in FY20 for the total amount of $29.1 million. So we are on track with referendum reserves. And this slide illustrates those reserves. The green portion of the bar shows how reserves growing. The first year, 2018, was the first year we actually added money to our fund balance. The peak will take place in FY '22, which is the last year projected to have a operating surplus. And afterwards, we are projecting, again, this is on autopilot. It means nothing is done, no efficiencies, additional efficiencies are put in place, and we just continue eating into our reserves. And eventually in FY '25, we will find ourselves under the 25% required fund balance. The board have seen this graph. You've seen this graph 6 months ago. Represents structural deficit, and the red bar represents the year when the operating deficits will begin, which means we are in structural deficit right now. We're not the only ones. It's impossible to eliminate, primarily because how education in Illinois is funded. We only get 6% of state revenues, and the majority, 80% of our revenue, is under tax cap, which means it's under 2%. This year, it's 2.1%. So it's very difficult when you stuck against it. Expenditures for transportation, for example, that's going up 30%. Our personnel expenditures, they are going higher. So we're still dealing with it, but our goal is to obviously to bring those lines closer together. The gap between those lines is where those structural deficits lives. So these are, we put together this slide just with some ideas that you've seen before, how to eliminate future deficits, which are coming. FY '23 is the first year when we will experience those deficits. And because 80% of our expenditures are staffing, we can't really do it by eliminating non-personnel expenditures. Even if we cut the entire line for supplies and capital, we wouldn't do any capital improvements, no technology, we still wouldn't eliminate a deficit, the $3 million deficit. So we have to do it through by controlling rate of compensation, which is, again, very hard because how this compensation is structured, right? I mean, for some groups, teacher assistants, the compensation is very high. It's more than 5%. Size of workforce, we have to, I mean, we've been controlling the cost of staffing through retirements. This year, the budget includes 14 retirements. Subsequent years include 11 certified retirements. Attrition, so that's really helping to control the cost of staffing. We also will be doing, probably starting next year, program evaluation through performance management. And of course, we have to evaluate all these efficiencies and reductions through equity lens. We will continue priority budgeting. We will be following board's resolution and be using zero-based budgeting. Zero-based budgeting, it is difficult because you can only use it for non-personnel expenditures. As you notice, a lot of our contracts are being renegotiated. We interviewing auditing firm next month, actually this month, and the bids they came in, we're already going to be saving money. So we're looking at a lot of our services, goods on annual basis, but it's not enough, obviously. And then the last point, again, we feel strongly that we need to be looking at the current resources before we hire additional staff, because if you look at the student projections, which are projected to be flat and declining, we continue to hire additional staff. And I said, the district, if you look at the last year, the year before, it's usually net 20, 30 positions every year, and this is unsustainable.
We can't overstate the fact that at the end of the day, we have limited control over revenue at the end of the day, because the majority of our revenue is from property tax, which is capped by PTEL. But we have absolute control over expenditure. And the largest drivers of expenditure are people. 80% of our expenditure is people. So that's really where the savings are, and I really can't overstate. So I think it's important for us to be very thoughtful about adding additional people and the associated benefits that goes with that.
Thank you. So that's a good kickoff to, I guess the big question is, for us as a board, as a committee, like what's the structure of a workshop, series of workshops for us to be educated enough in the programs, right? This lovely board book has a lot of programs with costs associated with it. You know, the timeline, we've actually had this conversation before for years. You know, are we talking about a need to be educated to make some decisions now? Is that your recommendation? I mean, that's how I feel, but I think we as a group need to talk about kind of the board values and what are our financial goals as it means responsibility to the district and being able to have sustainability going forward.
We've been talking for a while about how to get the community involved in this conversation, and I think, you know, all of our schools belong to all of us, and we should be having the conversation collectively about the decisions that we need to make. It shouldn't be a surprise, and not everyone has the chance to follow every single one of our finance meetings. And when I say not everyone, I mean not a lot of people.
Hello to both.
Yeah, most people. So I don't think I don't want this conversation to be a surprise, and I don't want anyone to feel like they didn't have their opportunity to contribute. And collectively, we can make our schools great in many, many ways, and our community does contribute. I mean, we don't currently have a line in the budget to look at the amount of volunteer hours that we have contributed to our schools, but we have a tremendous amount of skill set and volunteer hours that folks contribute to every single one of our schools. And I think we need to have a community conversation about the difficult decisions that we need to make, because it's clear that we can't just trim around the edges here in order to get to solvency. So I would like to talk more specifically. You know, we've talked in generalities about having this conversation early and often and including the community, but we haven't gotten specific about it, and it hasn't happened. And at this point, you know, we're just a couple years away now, and I don't think it's something we want to launch into a few months before anything changes need to happen.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. I think these conversations can't wait, and I think we need to think about, you know, as the budget's being prepared, maybe there are some things, like I appreciate the transportation costs, maybe there's some other things similar to that we can make decisions on as an administration and board, but I think beyond that, and as early as the fall of next year, we really need to start doing the education for the education for the board probably needs to start earlier, but then for sure, figure out how there's going to be town halls for the community to better understand where we are and what are the types of analysis that we're doing, and think, you know, what the programmatic costs are, and, even things like Camp Timberley, that if we're thinking about eliminating or adjusting that, like, I think we just need to, people get upset when they feel like they're blindsided by it. So the earlier that we can be transparent that we're having these conversations, I think the better. And I think too, I appreciate the notion that, yes, as it should be in a school district, our largest expense is around people, and we do need to figure out how we can find efficiencies there. I just think we also need to be clear that that has to include consultant costs. And where that might be, if we're going to be asking our educators in the classroom to find ways to be more efficient or, and have on that burden, I think our administrative staff also has to figure out how to get the same work done, but maybe relying less on consultants for the same work. So to make sure that we are looking there as well and have a better handle on those expenditures.
That timing works out well with the arrival of Dr. Horton also.
Excuse me.
Bless you.
I kind of see it in two prongs, because I feel like what we've talked about is the major restructuring discussion, but what we haven't been doing in that meantime, and I'm looking specifically at 2021, is reining in expenses so we're not worsening the problem until we get to an ultimate solution. So I was thrown by the fact that, with our current projections, and I know some of this is based on the transportation, which may be shifted, but we're projecting revenue increases of 1.47%, which went up because of the CPI, but our expense increases went up, is 3.93. So, that's almost 3 times, right, versus this past year where there was a difference, but the structural difference was much less. And so from a board standpoint, what I see the board's responsibility in is setting a parameter around what is our guidepost in terms of that gap and how we're gonna, certainly not worsen it, but what is the immediate discussion is, what are we gonna do for 2021? What can we still do for 1920? We have had reductions in number of students. We haven't had a commensurate look at our staffing plan accordingly. We had 100 less students this year, and we've added positions. So I know that it's not as easy because kids aren't all in one class that you can just say that class is gone, but we've got to do the intermediate work. Otherwise, when we get to this larger restructuring piece, the mountain will be even bigger, and it'll be harder to climb. So. And I think the community expects us to do our work, which is like, look at what you can do now and what you're committed to doing. Then we have larger discussions on large scale program changes or whatever that is. But I don't want to see this level of, in a budget for the next year, I would not want to see this level of difference between revenue and expenses. And I feel like we have to take on what changes can be made. And we have to start those larger conversations, but we can't keep spending more money while we're waiting to fix the problem.
So I agree that it is our duty to make sure that we are setting some guideposts now. I think that it's also our duty to consider the experiences that children are having in our district and how the district is structured in order to change some of the types of experiences that folks had maybe 5-10 years ago. And I think some of the investments have been to look at how to improve the experience of marginalized children and families. And so I think that has to be part of our discussion as well. We want to, and that's why I think that it's important to have the community in the discussion and giving us input. And if we don't have a structure for doing that immediately, then I would ask that that be part of what's presented to us. Bringing that equity lens to to the funding discussions. Because some of the personnel costs, at least in this last year, were related to the discussion that we had about how to respond to the traumas that were previously being responded to by police and SRO use, in order to provide supports for people who are in crisis, actual social emotional supports. And I think that is an important experience to change for children, and I think that is a worthy investment. And if we're going to change that investment, we need to think about what that would mean for the folks who would be impacted by that, not just the bottom line. I think we have to look at both.
I don't think that, well, my point was we need to make choices, right? I agree with the investments we made because we set an expectation around restorative work and what we're going to do. We have to deliver on that. We have to support our teachers and our classrooms through those expenses, but we can't all add on. Then we have to make other choices about where we can pull back or restructure.
I don't
That's
think.
all I'm saying is we can't have everything, and that investment does take a priority. But what then? So in 1 year we may have made an investment to start that, but what's the infrastructure that needs to be maintained, because it has to be maintained, and then what other choices do we need to make and say, well, we're going to have to pull back on something. It's not easy conversation, and that does require the community, but I think from a board standpoint, I do believe we need to take a stake in the ground that says our expectation is that we're not going to be broadening this. Part of the resolution that we had after the referendum was that we were going to, retain the reserves that we could. And we are making, I'm not saying we're not doing that, because we are maintaining that, but in looking at a referendum or a balance for 2025 of 11 million in September and then seeing 8 million, that's startling. Not all that money went, we need to know where that is, what choice did we make, and can we make other choices, because we can't do it all. So that's all I'm saying. And the board does not have the expertise to do that. We need to be presented with options, and there may be some near-term things that can be done that are still choices. Given, there are commitments we made because we need, regardless of how many students we have, we still have to make those commitments because we have to be staffed, we have to support our educators. In a flat or declining, what else? What is not optimized across the district? Such that we could look at those things short of waiting 2 years when the cliff's falling. That's all I'm saying.
I think ultimately you and I didn't say anything different. I mean, I think in the fall, we have to start having a plan to educate the board and community and involve the community on the long-term programmatic structural changes that we have to do. That doesn't stop us from this year, for example, with the transportation costs and finding other efficiencies like that and figuring out what those are to implement right away. And I think it will be helpful once we have the actual transportation numbers to know what the actual disparity is for next year. And then, I agree. I think you do have to present us with some options of where we can cut in a way that, as a board, we're comfortable saying, okay, that is a decision that we can make now that isn't cutting a program or something that does ultimately require greater community input.
I think all of this the entire discussion is unpopular, and I accept that as a reality, but I think there's a couple things that just come to mind. Years ago, before the referendum was passed, the board ultimately got to a presentation by administration that had programs and costs associated with it and recommendations, right? There was a process that led that way. I think it's important for the administration, the staff, to go through and decide whether that process was a good process the first time or the last time, whether that should be duplicated or not. And if not, then what would be a better process that has community engagement involved, that has staff involved, right, all stakeholders. There are things that come to mind, investments that I really believe in, that prompt questions in my own mind around partnerships within the community. We had a meeting with the City of Evanston city manager and an alderwoman where we were asked to take on more costs for things like crossing guards. In the same vein, I thought to myself, I'm so proud of our investment in Beyond Diversity training and seed training and all those things, but now once we've trained our staff, now we're also offering training to the community. And does the partnership go both ways for us to have some shared costs with the City of Evanston and other organizations? Like, does the school district have to carry that burden to educate the community? And I believe in it, and I yet still want to ask the unpopular question. Camp Timberley, I went to it. I'm a camp person, but like $300,000 over a couple of years is $300,000 over a couple of years, and we want an expert lens on whether or not that, next to all the other options, is something that we have to consider. And there's a lot of those. I'm thinking about, professional development, whether we do in town, in this room, professional development versus sending people to conferences or out of state. And there's a host of areas where more granularly where money is spent, that I think we need to see a tightening of the belt in that way. And I think it sounds like we all agree with that, but we kind of want to hear it articulated out in the public so that we all know what's being done, the due diligence of that, before we have to actually consider things that involve teachers and kids.
And I think also, potentially not a particularly popular idea, but do we need to think about board policy change that requires certain expenditures to come before us explicitly before they're made, so that we can have a transparent discussion around what the expenditures are for, or, over X amount that it has to come before the board. Just so a way for us to institutionalize, having a better handle and control of those costs.
I guess I would say, it's, in my mind, it's better for us to set guidelines of where we want to see increases or making decisions one-off one at a time,
Is
right,
not
in
efficient.
isolation, is
not ideal.
very challenging. But to say, we have this much room that needs to be trimmed, or with an equity lens, we still want to, have our gap be less than X. I would feel more, we could codify that in a policy, but I would feel more comfortable doing that and then approving every line item, right? Because we have less visibility into, and would then have to start talking about, well, how does this relate to last month's and which is more important? But we'd be looking at them in isolation versus looking at it from a macro standpoint. I think we're heading in the same direction. We need some level of oversight or guidance that, along with this process, can say, this is what we're driving towards. And, I don't see anyone, you guys started the conversation with, we know that we need to adhere to something. So what is that something? And then what are the options on how? Right. And I would say there's a near-term something, which is, for the remainder of this year and for next year, what is reasonable that we can, how can we, mitigate the escalation of growth? What is reasonable there relative to what we have presented? Is there anything more reasonable? And then beyond that.
And you know the cycle of change in whether it's curriculum adoption or social emotional programming, right? We decide to invest in something, buy a new curriculum, pay for the training, and then those costs don't carry over the next 5 years because you're implementing it. When it comes to making our schools healthier and safer for students of color, we invest in seed training, we invest in Beyond Diversity, we get everybody trained, we expect to see certain outcomes. We see it in the suspension rates dropped, but does the training piece have to sustain at the same level? So when, I'm not talking about lowering the training, I'm talking about is the cost of
For just new.
for maintaining or continuing to build healthy and safe and welcoming school environments require the same kind of intensity and investment that the change initiative takes. And you know, you can look across all the programs, what does that look like and where can we pull back? I think those are types of questions that I'd like to see.
So would it be a reasonable request for us to say that for the next finance committee meeting, I need to go back to Candace's point of, you know, whatever the gap in revenues and expenditures was or is for this year, though if we set a parameter that we don't want to see that gap increase or only want to see it, you know, increase by whatever, let's say we don't want to see it increase. What does that mean? How much would that require? How much of a reduction would that require? And then also with a recommendation of where those reductions would come from. I don't know what that number would be, so
That would
I
be
don't
on
know
a
if that's.
percentage basis, not on a raw dollar basis, like the percentage of the gap this year, because the dollars are higher.
The percentage of the gap is what I mean, yes. So if we say we don't want that gap to increase in next year's budget, what does that mean? What does that mean in dollars, and where, how much would we need to cut and where?
So we're talking about quantifying the structural deficit for a
Correct.
particular year, so we can get to the amount, and then we could have some options.
Correct.
Kind of using this year as the
This-
baseline
right.
for the deficit. So next year, we're trying to have the same percentage gap. That would,
Honestly, let's be clear though, it's gonna involve reduction in people. Let's just be clear about that.
I think we all understand
Because it's the largest driver of cost. I just wanted to make that clear. Anyone involved, hiring freeze, for example, and it will also involve reduction of bodies. I just want to make that clear. If we want to see significant changes, that's the fixed cost that's driving
Talking
it.
about just
just the next,
the difference between, so we can get basically two lines to meet, right, and then whatever is extra, that would go up.
I'm basically saying that the delta of the gap, which in your picture
Yeah.
gets bigger next year, would not get
Would
bigger.
not get bigger.
It would stay
So
the
it wouldn't
same.
get smaller, but it wouldn't get bigger.
Wouldn't get smaller, because we're doing, but to maintain that same gap, which this year is, 6% in revenue or 6% in expense, because we had a higher expense because we did add additional staff, versus 4.25.
So we're talking about next year, FY
So if we're looking at
For the next,
2021.
as we're preparing next year's
if you were to
budget.
if you were to parallel that same,
And I think to your
I
point.
just wanted to make the expectation
I know,
clear.
there's still
Yeah,
maybe,
the very first bullet of your second slide or the first slide that had words on it was that the district continues to improve its financial position. That is only because the referendum dollars are coming in and we're putting them in the bank. That's not because we're in a good financial position.
Correct. Yeah.
And the referendum dollars are giving us a window to have this conversation in a way that's not a drastic emergency conversation, which will become an emergency if we wait a little bit longer.
Absolutely.
And so I think that's why if we can next month at least start having the discussion of what does that look like? I mean, I appreciate, yes, if that's going to look like a reduction in staff. I think we need to, right now it's all just ephemeral. Like we're not, I think we do need to have some concrete discussions of what that is. And I think we need to, again, like I said, that has to include, when we're talking about people, it has to include consultant reductions. I think it does have to include PD, travel for PD and that sort of thing. Like, so now we're not looking strictly at teacher reductions or, paraprofessional reductions or whatever the case is, that we're looking across the board of people.
So, thank you, Suni, because that was one of the things that I was going to say, is that I think what I would like to see coming back is that something that is going to be across the board, so it's not targeting one or impacting one over the other. I think one thing I was trying to understand, I think this is what Candace was, if I look at this structural deficit one, how it goes from 6.19 for the expenditures to 3.93. I'm just curious, what was the difference that created that lower number? Because it made me wonder what was removed and how then can we emulate that or not? Maybe that's the answer. And then there are a couple things that, for me at least, I'm gonna want as you're coming back and maybe a little more detail, is that we do have this rolling ongoing curriculum cycle, right, of curriculum review and adoption and or pilot and or, so I don't know where that fits in, and I think that we're gonna need to see that because that is part of the commitment for our educating of our students. So where does that fit in? Is that under?
Under supplies.
Okay, so minimal change in allocation, I guess, so does that mean that that is going to account for all of our rolling adoptions that are coming annually and our updating of student systems and the HR systems? I mean, I guess I would like to see more detail because it's, we're doing some bigger things in the next couple of years that we haven't done in the past years, so it's just a surprise to me that it would be minimal change.
So the ERP system is added, but this is not a budget.
It's a projection.
This is just projection.
Absolutely.
So it doesn't really have, the details inside, because again, it's projections. But I feel strongly about this projected amount. And by the way, all of the numbers will change
Absolutely.
during the budget building process. But this amount should accommodate the adoption and the ERP module. It should be sufficient.
And I think all I'm wondering is that as you're having the conversations about what needs to maybe be reduced, that we also be clear about what is being maintained or what those funds will cover so that there's some clarity and transparency, so that there's no room for misunderstanding that maybe a curriculum won't go through or it won't. It will or it won't. So here we need to cut personnel, but yes, we're going to continue and maintain the curriculum. We're going to need to, I just think that when we get to the place where we can be as granular as possible, it's going to help in creating a shared understanding of what we can maintain and what we need to look at for reduction. And I think my last request is that whatever conversations, I want to be clear that the community is all the entities of the people within District 65 that might be impacted. So I just wanted to be clear that when we say community, it's all stakeholders.
All stakeholders, absolutely.
For shared understanding. Thank you.
Are there any questions about any of those expectations or hopes and dreams?
No. I mean, this is the
The
same,
transportation.
this is the same thing that we would love to do. Because the way we look at our charge here is to make sure whatever we do doesn't hurt kids. We're in the student business. We're not in the business of just deficit reduction, efficiencies, projections. We want to make sure that long-term, the students have the resources they need to be able to reach their fullest potential long-term. And that's the business that we're in. So, yeah.
So Candace had two things. I think we just talked about number two. Number one was restructuring, the broader restructuring conversation. And I think somewhere in the springtime, probably with input from our new superintendent, it would be nice to understand a timeline for us as a board, again, getting educated on what is going into the broader conversation around looking at programs and alignment and efficiencies that are bigger than just the expense conversation. That might be conversations around boundaries, that might be conversations around revamping transportation and, things that, again, really unpopular topics that have to be discussed out in the open. Awesome. So without anything else, our next meeting will be on March 9th, 2020. And I move to adjourn at, I can't see the clock.
8:38.
8:38.